But what Marx talked about was capitalist society that was being born in the middle of the 19th century. And what's extraordinary about the Communist Manifesto is that he was able, even at a time when capitalism was in its infancy, to identify the central features of capitalism that are with us to this day. And the things that are unique about it, we're going to talk about in a moment. One thing is clear, that if anybody were to have a fight over trademarks about the 99% to the 1%, I would argue that Karl Marx has a claim on it. Very early on, in the Manifesto, this is a wonderful annotated version, by the way. The Manifesto itself is no more than 50 pages. He talks very clearly, at some points poetically, about what is developing in this new class society. And what he writes is this. He says, society as a whole is more and more splitting into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. Proletariat was the fancy word, essentially, of the working class. And when he talks about this, again, he's not the first to talk about this. Adam Smith, one might say, a fellow who those people admire, right? Talked about all of that. But what was unique about Marx's contribution was his identification as the working class, of the working class, as the grave digger, the potential grave digger of a new system that was immiserating people's lives just as it was developing technology and the ability for all human beings to eat, to get health care, to be educated, to be housed, to have sanitation systems. It also denied that to the majority of the world's population who actually did the labor. Again, he's talking about the essence of a system that is with us to this day and is the reason for this encampment and the squares of rebellion across the world. The next thing he talks about is the inherent feature of capitalism to constantly revolutionize itself, to constantly change. And again, he's phenomenally poetic when he writes about it. You've heard one part of the quote before, I assume. Let's read the whole thing. He says, constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier times. All fixed, fast-frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. And here's the part you've heard. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profane. And what he is writing about is essentially, before capitalism is even developed beyond London, Brussels, and New York, he is writing about globalization, about an inherent feature of markets to gobble up one another, of the bourgeoisie to go to war with each other, against who, to determine who will control those new markets. He goes on to talk about something we all understand and feel in our gut, and that in some ways is driving these protests. He talks about alienation. And here he doesn't mean so much the kind that you talk about on the couch with your shrink. He is talking about a material relationship. Here is how Marx describes alienation. He says about the worker, about the person who produces the wealth in society, and by that he didn't just mean factory workers. He meant people, even though he didn't know about Starbucks, who serve coffee. He meant people who work at McDonald's. He meant people who work in offices, pick up the garbage, teach the kids, and all the shit that we do. He said this about the worker. He becomes an appendage of the machine, and it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. and talks about how machines that we ourselves produce come to control us, and that ideas that human beings create, such as religion, come to control us. And this is what Marx meant by alienation. He goes on to say about all of this, a central feature that is unique to capitalism and that exists the world over, and that is exploitation. Exploitation, what weaves all of our lives together and what drives us out of bed every morning, even with hatred in our gut, to go to work if we're lucky enough to be exploited. As an African socialist once said, if there's anything worse than being exploited by capitalism, it's not being exploited by capitalism. Being unemployed. What we often in this country think of as exploitation is only the most extreme form. We are taught to think that exploitation is what happens in Guatemala in a factory. And that's true. That is exploitation. Hyper-exploitation, super-exploitation. It's what happens in the iPhone factories in China of Steve Jobs, where people who work 32-hour shifts kill themselves in order for a $600 smartphone to come onto the market in the Western world. That is a form of exploitation, but it's not the only form of exploitation. Everyone who works, you and you and you and me, are all exploited. Without exploitation, capitalism could not exist. And I'll explain to you what Marx meant. There's a Starbucks over there, on that corner. In an hour in the morning, at that Starbucks, let's just make it easy. 100 people come through those doors. Inside the Starbucks, there are 2 workers. Each worker makes $12 an hour. On average, each of the 100 people spend $5 for their doppio, latte, pumpkin spice, whatever the fuck. Okay? On average. If you add up that money, $5 times 100 people, that's $500. The 2 people behind the counter, how much were they paid? $12 an hour. Add them together, $24 in 1 hour. You add to that the cost of the beans, the water, the electricity, and the rent, amortized out into that 1 hour, it probably costs Mr. Starbucks $80 an hour. Maybe, let's be generous, rents are high here, $100 an hour to keep the doors open on that Starbucks. But what did we just say they took in that hour? $500. So it costs $100 to keep the doors open, $500. What's that extra $400? Profit. It's money stolen. Surplus value in Marx's term, stolen from us. All of us produce surplus value, fancy term for profit. If they paid a fair wage